Hey guys, so we are now getting into a lot more fun stuff. These are things that we'll see and actually get to talk about in the classroom, like in relation to yourself. So I know a lot of times, a lot of these things are things like we can't see mitosis, we can't see meiosis, we can't see cellular respiration. So it's really not that interesting to me. Well, this is stuff in genetics and in inheritance that you actually get to see and you get to observe. So we are going to be observing dominant and recessive traits, but first we need to know a little bit of background on that. And some of this stuff is not new. I don't really think that this will be as challenging for you, especially this video, because you should have had this in mostly like 8th grade or 7th grade. So, if you do have any questions, though, please make sure you're writing down these types of questions so that you can ask me in class. I realize that you guys are just kind of sitting there, and then right before test, you're like, I don't understand this. Well, if you don't understand it right now, you need to be writing questions down so you can ask me in class or ask me at any other time. All right. At the end of this video, you should be able to explain why and how Mendel studied pea plants, describe the results of Mendels experiments, state Mendels laws of segregation and independent assortment, and then finally outline the genetics of inheritance. So more towards the end of this video, you'll probably find it interesting. All right, so first we need to talk about what is genetics. And genetics is the study of heredity. So basically everything that it makes up you is because you inherited from your parents. So as much as maybe you don't like your parents, but you still have got qualities and things that make you look like who you are because of your parents. And so pretty nice thing that they did for you. Unfortunately, genetics is just a one-way thing, so you can inherit not so great things from your parents as well. So like genetic diseases or the chances of cancer and different things like that. So we're going to talk about this guy by the name of Gregor Mendel. And Gregor Mendel was a super genius because guess what he did? He decided, I'm going to go to school to become a monk. And really, maybe you don't think that's a genius, but what happened was while he was in school, becoming a monk, he decided he was going to study science. So not only was his science views or whatever, his studies paid for, but he didn't have to pay for any education because he was becoming a monk. He was dedicating his time to the church. So pretty smart on his end, I gotta tell you. He decides to study science, and more particularly, he decides to study inheritance because at the time, there was this theory known as the blending theory of inheritance. And what this theory is the fact that you have an offspring, which an offspring is just, so that would be you compared to your parents. It's who's produced from a parent generation. In the offspring, in the blending theory, I can't even talk, sorry. This theory basically stated that offspring are a mixture of different parents, of two different parents. So for example, if you have if you have red paint and you have white paint, you mix it together, you get pink paint. And that was the really popular theory in Mendel's time. Now, Mendel noticed some different things when he was looking at his garden. He noticed that when you have a very tall plant, and you pollinate it with a short plant, the offspring are not medium in size. They're either tall or they're short. So he was like, this blending theory isn't necessarily the answer. And so he decides, I'm going to study pea plants and continue on. All right, so like I said on the last slide, Mendel's studying pea plants. And what he notices that, again, the parents or the offspring are not necessarily always a blend of each other, but they have traits that are of one parent or the other. And so I want to talk for a minute here about the fact that Mendel is an incredibly lucky person. So yes, he's the father of genetics. Yes, he was incredibly brilliant in the fact that he could observe these things, and he studied thousands of plants, like 30,000 plants to be closer to the number. So quite a bit. It's not like he didn't do the work, but studying pea plants is a great source because not only are you looking at something that you can control, but the time span for the pea plants to grow is shorter than other types of offspring. So for example, if he looked at animals, they have a certain time of incubation that they sit in their mother's womb. Same thing with humans. So he decided, again, he studied pea plants, but he was incredibly lucky as well. Things really, really worked out in his favor when it came to these pea plants. So while I'm not saying that it was just luck, I am saying that he had a stroke of luck here that did dub him the father of genetics. So anyway, Another reason why he studied pea plants is because of the fact that all of these characteristics are obvious and very much visible to see. So he focused solely on things like seeds, flower color, pods, and what those pods look like. So form and color of those, and stems. So altogether, he studied about 7 different traits or characteristics in pea plants. So if you're looking at all of those characteristics in one go, it can be very overwhelming. So Mendel decided to take it back a little bit. And he realized that in order to do this completely fail-proof, he needed to control pollination. And so pollination, what that is the fertilization step in the sexual reproduction of plants. So there's pollen, and that's the tiny grains, and those are the male gametes, and those will pollinate with your female gametes in the ovary. So plants have an ovary. We're not going to get into the whole, like, what a plant and the labeling, all of that. I'm not worried about that. But you definitely should know that Mendel controlled pollination. So he got the male gametes that he wanted from whatever plant, and he then pollinated that female plant. And this isn't like a new thing. This happens all the time with controlling pollination. But he knew that if he let these plants pollinate on their own, he may not get results, and he may not be able to observe exactly how these things are inherited on a controlled level. So remember, in experiments, we always try to control everything. All right, so in the next slide, we're going to talk about Mendel's experiments. And so what Mendel did was he wanted to look at various different traits, but he knew that it would be overwhelming at first. So in his first set of experiments, he looks at one characteristic at a time. And he starts with flower color. This is pretty obvious, right? You can tell if a flower is pink or blue. Unless you're colorblind, I'm sorry. So what he does, he cross-pollinates. Remember, he is controlling this. So he cross-pollinates a purple and a white flower. So the parent generation, that pea generation, is a purple and a white flower. Cross-pollinates them, and he waits to see what happens with the next generation. So the parent plants in the experiment are referred to again as the pea generation. The offspring of the parent generation, known as the F1s, or filial or offspring, but I'm always going to call them F1s, they exhibited purple flowers. So they exhibited the purple trait. And Mendel was like, okay, so where did the white go? We had a parent that was a white flower. Why are we not seeing that white characteristic in here? So he was like, okay, no big deal. He decided he was going to let the F1 generation, or all of those purple flowers, self-pollinate. All right. And what he found was that the F2s, so basically this would be the offspring of the F1s, he found that 75% of the flowers were purple, with 25% of those flowers being white. So there's that white trait. It appeared. And so for every 3 purple flowers, there was 1 white flower. I would say this is incredibly lucky. He really got his facts right here. The reason he wanted to self-pollinate, though, and I don't want you to get this all confused, he decided to have these self-pollinate because he wanted to test his theory on where that white flower characteristic went. So he knew that the white did not just disappear, that all of these purple flowers somehow have that white characteristic in them. Now he wanted to test that, so he let them self-pollinate. And out of that whole experiment, just with that one characteristic, Mendel comes up with this law known as the law of segregation. And what this states is that there are 2 factors controlling a given characteristics, one of which dominates the other. And these factors separate and go to different gametes when a parent reproduces. So basically what he's saying here, he's saying that there are 2 different characteristics. One is dominant to the other, so one will actually show over the other. And that when gametes are formed, they will be, they'll separate and they will go with whoever parent when reproduction occurs. Now, I want you to bear in mind that Mendel had no idea about chromosomes at this time. So he is doing this based off of just looking at things. And that's pretty impressive because nowadays we know chromosomes. We know we inherit these things. We know that there are particular genes. We know crossing over happens, law of segregation, that things happen independently of one another. And that will be the next law we talk about. But Mendel had no idea that chromosomes were even a thing. So very impressive. Now, the second set of experiments that Mendel did, he decided he was going to look at 2 characteristics at a time, because what he wanted to know was, is it more likely for you to get certain characteristics in conjunction with one another? So, for example, are purple flowers are always tall, or are they always short? Are white flowers always tall or always short? So what he ended up doing was he ended up crossing. So again, here's where he controlled everything. He ended up crossing certain characteristics with certain characteristics. So for example, he crossed plants with yellow round seeds and plants with green wrinkled seeds. So what he looked at was dominant genes compared to all recessive genes. And if you don't know those words yet, I will explain that here in a second. And he wanted to see what was produced with the offspring. So again, what Mendel observed was that plants in the F1 generation were all alike. All of them had yellow and round seeds, like one of the 2 parents. When the F1 generation plants self-pollinated, their offspring showed something a little bit different. They showed a huge combination of 2 different characteristics. So some had green round seeds, some had yellow wrinkled seeds. The combinations were incredibly different than that of the parent or the F1. And so Mendel comes up with this new law known as the law of independent assortment. And you should know what this is, because we kind of talked about this in the last chapter. But if you don't, here's a refresher. The law of independent assortment states that factors controlling different characteristics are inherited independently of one another. So what he's saying here is it's not a guarantee just because you're yellow and tall that your kids will be yellow and tall, or that your kid won't have yellow and short. So independent assortment, meaning that everything that we inherit is independent of one another. Or in this slide that I just turned, we're going to talk about Mendel's. Now, how does this all relate to us and what we see on our characteristics? Because obviously we're not plants, but the fact that Mendel could observe this gave us a lot of insight. Now, unfortunately for Mendel, his stuff was ignored for quite a long time. He was working in a monastery, and some people didn't really even take that super seriously. He didn't have a reputation. He wasn't like some rich guy that could just do all this. So unfortunately for him, his laws were not discovered for quite a bit. Charles Darwin, talking about evolution, didn't even mention the fact that Mendel was like talking about inheritance and all of this. So it wasn't until about 1900 where his work was discovered and he was given credit. So unfortunately for Mendel, during his life, he was not famous for any kind of experiment. Anyway, so let's go back to talking about genetics of inheritance. So characteristics of organisms are controlled by genes on chromosomes. The position of a gene on a chromosome is called its locus. So remember we talked about crossing over? This is a possible thing. So at a gene's location, known as a locus, you can basically swap that gene on an homologous chromosome. Genes for characteristics may have different versions called alleles. I'm going to backtrack a little bit. I want you to remember that in sexual reproducing organism, each individual has 2 copies of the same gene. Remember, one comes from your mom, one comes from your dad. Homologous chromosomes. Okay? It is very much possible that you have a gene that you are not expressing, but you still have. The gene for a characteristic may have a different version. So, for example, if both of your parents have blue eyes, you're more likely to express that blue eye expression. And I'm using this example because it's very much obvious, but like my husband and I, Barry has blue eyes, I have brown eyes. Both of our kids express brown eyes. Well, Jackson has a hazel eye, but we're going to say brown because Anyway, so they both have expressed brown eyes, but it does not mean that Barry's blue eye allele went away. So he still gave our kids that allele for blue eyes. So there's a strong possibility our kids will probably have, or not our kids, our grandkids may have blue eyes depending on whom my kids decide to marry, if I allow that to happen, because you guys know no one's good enough for my babies. But anyway, I digress. The different versions are called alleles. So for example, in pea plants, there's a purple flower allele and a white flower allele. Different alleles account for much of the variation in characteristics of organisms. During meiosis, homologous chromosomes separate and go to different gametes. We know this. Thus, the 2 alleles for each gene also go to 2 different gametes. At the same time, different chromosomes assort independently, and this results in alleles for different genes assorting independently as well. In this way, alleles are shuffled and recombined in each parent gamete. So you don't know which gamete you're getting when you form a zygote. But the fact of the matter is there's always two alleles, and there is the same percentage of chance of you getting one or the other. So once fertilization occurs and that zygote is formed, remember that's a diploid zygote, that diploid zygote inherits two alleles for each gene. One allele comes from each parent. We've already talked about this. The alleles an individual inherits makes up the individual's genotype. So this is basically what makes you who you are, but they're the things that you cannot see. Okay, so the two alleles may be the same or different. And so what I mean by that is you could be a homozygote, meaning you have two of the same alleles. And usually this is represented by a capital or a lowercase letter. And I'm going to do this in class too, because I know you're probably just sitting here listening and like, what the heck is she talking about? And then you could be a heterozygote where you have two different alleles. So my kids are pretty good examples of heterozygotes for eye color, especially because my husband has blue eyes, which is a recessive gene. So you have to, generally both of your parents have to have blue eyes in order for you to have them. That's not always true. It is not always true, but because it also depends on the grandparents and so on and so forth and the genes that you have. But for the most part, both parents have to have blue eyes and they pass it on. So my kids are a heterozygote in eye color because they have a dominant brown eye color and a recessive blue eye color. And so that's a heterozygote when you don't have the same genotype. And like I said, I am going to show you what I mean by this in class tomorrow. So the expression, so the difference between genotype and what's known as a phenotype is the fact of what you're expressing. So the expression of an organism's genotype produces its phenotype. So what you're actually seeing. So for example, my kids both inherited brown and blue eye, but we only see brown eye. So we don't know, not everybody's going to know your backstory, and they're going to look at my kids and they're just going to think both your parents have brown eyes. Not knowing anything. Well, the expression that my kids express for eye color happens to be their phenotype, the brown eye color. So that's pretty well all I have. I know I talked quite a bit in this video. I really do enjoy genetics, so I hope that you start to enjoy it as well. If you have any questions, please make sure you're asking me on Edpuzzle. Please make sure you're asking me somewhere in any given form. I don't remember what else I was going to say, so I will end it like that.